What's up everybody, blessed be, my name is Manon and you are watching Witch in the Working, where we will be discussing all things witchy in and around, throughout and about, above, below, and beyond. This video offers my personal views on the topic at hand. Please visit me on my other platforms as well, including Facebook, Instagram, and Patreon, all linked down in the description below. The full script to this video and most of the others is available on my Patreon account for download if desired, to build your very own Witch in the Working Book of Shadows. Do you need help with a spell or fancy a tarot reading? Shoot on over to my store, Bewitching and Bizarre, with choices listed down in the description below for your personalized working and or reading. This is another one of those videos that I'm going to definitely catch some flack on, but it's in my heart and I want to get it out, so we're going to have to do it. You know, when most people talk about witchcraft or Wicca, they think they already know the story. Some picture it as this ancient, unbroken tradition stretching back thousands of years, while others dismiss it as something dreamed up a few decades ago by eccentric poets and storytellers. Somewhere in the middle of that tug-of-war sits Ronald Hutton, a historian whose book, The Triumph of the Moon, has become the loudest voice in the room. This version of the story has shaped not only how outsiders see us, but even how many witches and pagans understand their own path. But here's the thing, history isn't always as neat as a single narrative makes it out to be. Hutton himself, after he wrote and published Triumph of the Moon, has since gone on to explain how he could have been wrong about some of his extremist views against Wicca and witchcraft. Fortunately, in my opinion, the damage is done. I want to be open about my perspective, even if it may challenge opinions both inside and outside the community. Personally, I do not connect with Ronald Hutton's viewpoint against Wicca, especially knowing how strongly he worked to redefine Wicca in ways that stripped it from its foundational roots. Some claim he was trying to help Wicca, which was like trying to put out a fire using gasoline as far as I'm concerned. In my eyes, he presented a version of Wicca built on a narrative that doesn't hold up when weighed against other evidence, and yet many people accepted it without question. And again, since then, Hutton himself has had to come full stop and take another look and give a heavy reevaluation of what he portrayed in Triumph of the Moon. Me personally, not happy at all. Before I get into today's topic, I want to be really clear about why I'm making this video. This is not an attack on Ronald Hutton as a person, nor is it an attempt to shame anyone who finds value in his work. My goal here is to share a perspective, my own, as well as that of author Ben Whitmore in Trials of the Moon, about why the Triumph of the Moon has had such a complicated and, in my opinion, damaging effect on modern Wicca. I'm doing this because I believe history is never one-sided, and no one single scholar gets the final word on who we are or where we come from. Wicca deserves to be seen in its full richness, as a modern religion, yes, but also as something deeply connected to older traditions, myths, and practices that Hutton's narrative tends to brush aside. My hope is that by opening this discussion, you'll feel empowered to explore the history yourself, ask questions, and ultimately decide what resonates with you. This isn't about tearing anyone down. It's about reclaiming our story and honoring the depth of the craft we practice today. Hutton's book, Triumph of the Moon, shaped two groups in particular. The first are those who began on an eclectic Wiccan path, but later chose to move away from the full structure of Wicca, focusing only on the witchcraft aspects or the folk magic aspects, and adopting terms like traditional witchcraft. The second are those within the traditional lines, Gardnerian or Alexandrian, who, during the cultural shifts of recent years, found Hutton's stance appealing because he dismissed Wicca as a fertility religion. This allowed them to reshape Wicca's narrative, downplaying its fertility roots despite the historical and ritual evidence that points clearly in that direction. A third is how he caused many elders of traditions to have a crisis of faith, so to speak, and flat out abandon the craft, all off of false narrative, as many of his claims have now been debunked. For anyone interested in seeing another point of view, I will link a book down in the comments below called Trials of the Moon by Ben Whitmore. He originally put it out in 2010 as a direct response to Ronald Hutton's The Triumph of the Moon. Whitmore's goal was to challenge Hutton's conclusions, point out where he believed Hutton misrepresented sources, and reopen the discussion about possible continuities between ancient pagan practices, folk traditions, and modern witchcraft. In this series, we're going to peel back the layers and take a closer look at what happens when one person's interpretation becomes the official truth. We'll talk about the myths Hutton tore down, the new myth he built in their place, and the evidence he conveniently set aside. Most importantly, we'll explore what this means for us today as practicing witches and pagans, how his story has affected our identity, our credibility, and our connection to the old ways. This isn't about clinging to fantasies, but about reclaiming our story with honesty, pride, and a sense of wonder. That was a very long intro. Sorry, guys, but nevertheless, roll intro. Welcome back, everybody. There's something important to remember when we talk about academics and scholars. Having a title or a stack of books under your name doesn't automatically make you the final authority on a subject. Scholars can give us valuable insights, sure, but they're also human. They bring their own perspectives, biases, and blind spots to the table. And history shows us time and time again that scholars have gotten things wrong, sometimes spectacularly wrong. Take the case of Troy, the legendary city from Homer's Iliad. For centuries, most academics insisted Troy was nothing more than a myth, a poetic invention with no basis in reality. Generations of scholars dismissed the idea of an actual Trojan War as fantasy. Then, in the late 1800s, Heinrich Schliemann went digging in modern-day Turkey and uncovered ruins of a city that matched Homer's description. Suddenly, what was once brushed off as pure legend had archaeological backing. Scholars had to backtrack, admit their mistake, and rewrite what they thought they knew. That example reminds us of a simple truth. Just because something is accepted in academia doesn't make it permanent or infallible. New discoveries, fresh perspectives, and alternative voices can change the entire picture. So when someone like Ronald Hutton declares that his interpretation is the final word on Wicca and witchcraft, we should remember Troy. Even the most respected scholars can miss the mark, and sometimes what they dismiss as fantasy turns out to hold more truth than they realized. Hutton is a great example of that. When we talk about modern Wicca and witchcraft and its roots, there's always a few names that pop up in the conversation. One of them, of course, being Ronald Hutton. He would have you believe that he is not a witch or a practicing pagan, as he has never publicly acknowledged this. He's one of the most influential voices in shaping how both academics and the wider world understand our path. His book, The Triumph of the Moon, published back in 1999, didn't just land in bookstores, it landed like a thunderclap in the pagan community. For many people, it felt like the final word on where Wicca came from and what it means in the big picture of religious history. So why did his work hit so hard? Well, up until that point, a lot of the story about Wicca's roots was based on Gerald Gardner's claims and Margaret Murray's now infamous witch cult theory. Gardner told us that Wicca came from an ancient, secret tradition passed down through the ages, while Murray argued that witchcraft had been a hidden survival of pre-Christian pagan religion. These stories gave practitioners a sense of connection to the distant past, a link to something that had survived against the odds. But Hutton came along and told us, in no uncertain terms, that this was not the case. Hutton's central argument was pretty blunt. Wicca is a brand new religion. According to him, it was cobbled together in the 20th century by Gardner and others, pulling threads from romantic poetry, folklore studies, and ceremonial magic, and a dash of Victorian imagination. In his view, there's no unbroken line from the witches of history to the modern-day Wiccan circle. Witchcraft as a religion, he insisted, didn't exist until Gardner put the pieces together and called it Wicca. That was it. Case closed. For a lot of pagans, this was devastating. Imagine being told that the faith you practice, the rituals you perform, and the gods you honor don't have roots deeper than a few decades. That the traditions you thought connected you to your ancestors were actually just modern inventions dressed up in ancient robes. Some felt like the rug had been pulled out from under them. And to make matters more complicated, Hutton wasn't just some random critic. He was, and still is, a respected academic with a polished reputation and a warm, approachable personality. That made his conclusions harder to dismiss. Now, to be fair, Hutton wasn't trying to insult modern witches. In fact, he often said that stripping away the myths could give Wicca more credibility, because it could stand on its own merits rather than leaning on shaky historical claims. In his eyes, Wicca didn't need to prove itself ancient to be valid. It was meaningful, beautiful, and powerful right here and now. That perspective sounds generous on the surface, and some pagans embraced it, but for many others it came across as dismissive, even condescending. On the other hand, Philip Heselton, a respected historian on modern witchcraft, devoted more than 2 decades to investigating the origins of Gardnerian Wicca. In his books, Wiccan Roots, Jill Gardner and the Cauldron of Inspiration, and Witchfather, in his latest book, In Search of the New Forest Coven, he argues convincingly that the New Forest Coven was not a fabrication, but a real group active in southern England in the 1930s and 1940s. Gardner himself claimed to have been initiated into this coven in September of 1939, through connections made at the Rosicrucian Order Crotona Fellowship. Heselton identifies several members of that circle, drawing on historical records, personal correspondences, and testimonies. These include Dorothy Clutterbuck, known as Old Dorothy, who hosted Gardner's initiation, and Daffo, the nickname for Edith Woodford Grimes, whom Heselton confirms was an actual person and a key figure within the coven. He also highlights the Mason family, Ernest, Susie, and Rosetta, as longtime residents of Southampton with a background in esoteric circles like co-masonry and theosophy. According to Heselton, the Masons, along with Rosamond Sabine, sometimes called Mother Sabine, and Catherine Oldmeadow, form the spiritual backbone of the coven, contrary to claims that Gardner wholly invented it. Heselton presents a convincing case that Gardner's account wasn't pure invention. There appears to have been a genuine esoteric group in the New Forest that influenced and initiated him, rather than him allegedly creating everything from scratch. Turning our attention now back towards Hutton. The real impact of the Triumph of the Moon was bigger than just an academic debate. It reshaped how society at large talked about witchcraft. Journalists, teachers, and even casual readers picked up Hutton's book and repeated its conclusions as though they were undeniable fact. Suddenly, the popular image of Wicca shifted from a religion with ancient roots to a quirky new invention with no real history. That shift matters because it influenced how outsiders perceive us and even how we see ourselves. What's fascinating is that Hutton didn't just write history, he rewrote the story of an entire faith. He became the gatekeeper of what was considered serious scholarship on witchcraft. For some, this gave him a kind of celebrity status within the pagan world. I've heard many people describe him as a kind and generous man, someone who genuinely respects modern pagans. But respect for individuals doesn't erase the impact of ideas, and his ideas carried tremendous weight. When I look back at the arrival of Triumph, I see it as a turning point. It wasn't just the publication of another book. It was the moment when the academic establishment effectively told witches who we are, where we came from, and what we weren't. For newcomers to the craft, it set the tone for how they would understand their practice. For seasoned practitioners, it stirred doubt and forced them to reevaluate their beliefs. And for outsiders, it became the go-to explanation for what witchcraft really is. That's why Chapter 1 of this video starts here, with the rise of Ronald Hutton. To understand the debates we're having today about history, authenticity, and legitimacy, we have to look at how one historian's narrative became the dominant story. Whether we agree with him or not, his work changed the landscape. But here's the important part. History is never finished, and no single voice, no matter how authoritative, gets the last word. When Ronald Hutton published Triumph of the Moon, he didn't just tell a story about Wicca, he replaced one myth with another. Before his work, many witches carried a narrative passed down from Gardner and Margaret Murray, that witchcraft had somehow survived the persecutions, tucked away in hidden covens and folk traditions until it blossomed into the 20th century. It was a comforting story, one that tied modern practitioners to ancient roots. Hutton came along and said, not so fast. He tore down that old myth, but instead of leaving room for mystery, he built his own tidy version of history that left little space for continuity or depth. His new myth was that Wicca is entirely a product of the modern era, an invention of the 20th century with no genuine connection to the past. According to him, what we practice today was pieced together out of romantic poetry, ceremonial magic, and a pinch of folklore, and Gardner's flair for creativity. In this telling, witchcraft as a religion never existed before Gardner gave it form. To Hutton, witches of the early modern period weren't real witches at all, just unfortunate people caught in crossfire of superstition and paranoia. And the goddess traditions many of us honor? According to him, they were poetic fantasies, not actual living currents of devotion. Goddess worship didn't exist. At first glance, that might sound like a bold but honest take. After all, we know these survivalist theories of Murray don't hold up to serious scrutiny, but the problem is that Hutton didn't just challenge shaky claims. He went further, sweeping away large areas of evidence that suggested lingering pagan practices, ecstatic traditions, and goddess veneration did exist in one form or another. In trying to clean up Wicca's history, he created a new myth, one that claimed to be final and unquestionable. He claims Wicca was invented from scratch and everything else was fantasy. The danger here isn't just about dates or academic debates. It's about identity. Stories shape how we see ourselves. When you strip away every connection to the past, you tell a community that their roots don't matter, that they are practicing something brand new, disconnected from history, tradition, or ancestors. And for many witches, that stings. We may not believe that our covens stretch back in an unbroken line to the Stone Age, but we do feel a kinship with the cunning folk, the healers, the dreamers, and the people who spoke with spirits. To deny any continuity is to deny the threads of memory woven into the practice. What's interesting is that Hutton believed he was doing Wicca a favor. In his view, once you take away the false myths, you can build credibility on spiritual and ethical grounds alone. He thought this would free Wicca from being mocked for bad history, but the result was the opposite. Instead of respect, Wicca was often dismissed as a made-up curiosity, a kind of quirky patchwork religion that had no substance. Outsiders grabbed hold of Hutton's neat narrative and ran with it, leaving witches to look like role players in a costume drama rather than inheritors of meaningful traditions. And here's the twist. Myths aren't the enemy. Every religion has them. Myths carry truths that are bigger than literal fact. They give people a sense of belonging and purpose. What Hutton did was strip away one myth and replace it with another that was just as absolute but colder. His myth left no room for mystery, no allowance for the possibility that folk practices, goddess cults, or ecstatic traditions might have trickled down through the centuries in ways we can't fully measure. This video isn't about defending shaky history or pretending Wicca is thousands of years old. It's about recognizing that Hutton's clean version of events is still just a story that shuts down questions instead of opening them up. Real history is messy. It's full of overlaps, gray areas, and contradictions. By erasing all of that, Hutton gave the world a simple tale that's easy to repeat but doesn't reflect the richness of our spiritual heritage. When we step back, we can see the truth. Wicca is a modern religion, yes, but it carries echoes of the old ways. It draws inspiration from ancient goddess traditions, folk magic, seasonal celebrations, and the timeless human urge to connect with the sacred. Denying those echoes doesn't make Wicca stronger. It makes it hollow. If anything, the real story is far more fascinating than either Gardner's survivalist myth or Hutton's modernist one. It's a story of revival, creativity, and lineage, a living tradition that honors both the past and the present. That's why we call this part of the video a new myth in place of the old, because what Hutton offered wasn't the final word on witchcraft. It was just another version of the story, and now it's up to us to tell our own. One of the most frustrating things about Ronald Hutton's Triumph of the Moon is not just what he said, it's what he left out. For a book that claims to tell the full story of witchcraft and modern paganism, the silences are almost as loud as the words on the page. Hutton presented his work as if it was the final authority, a history scrubbed clean of myths and exaggerations. But when you start comparing his arguments with other research, it becomes clear that he skipped over or dismissed a mountain of evidence that didn't fit his neat conclusion. Take the ecstatic traditions of Europe, for example. Across the continent, people told stories of leaving their bodies in spirit, flying through the night, meeting with fairies, or joining processions of the dead. Groups like the Italian Benandanti claimed to fight battles in the spirit world to protect their community's harvest. In Romania, the Calusari performed ritual dances with clear shamanic overtones. These weren't just dreams or fantasies. They were deeply rooted practices with rules, preparation, and meaning. Yet Hutton brushed most of this aside, reducing them to psychological quirks or self-delusions rather than valid traditions. By doing so, he flattened the spiritual landscape of Europe into something far less colorful than it really was. Then there's the question of goddess worship. Hutton argued that ideas of a great mother or a triple goddess were modern inventions born out of 19th century imagination. But plenty of ancient evidence points otherwise. Goddesses like Isis, Sybil, Demeter, and Gaia weren't minor figures. They were central deities whose cults stretched across entire civilizations. In some places, they were even worshipped in triple or syncretic forms, much like the goddesses honored in modern pagan circles today. By denying this, Hutton not only erased key parts of history, but also undermined the lived connections that many pagans feel to those ancient figures. What makes this even more troubling is the way Hutton handled his sources. Trials of the Moon, the book that critiques his work, points out that he often quoted historians in ways that made them sound like they agreed with him, when in reality, many of them left room for pagan survivals. Some even argued explicitly that pre-Christian beliefs survived in folk magic, healing rituals, and seasonal celebrations. Instead of acknowledging that complexity, Hutton presented a version where every reputable scholar had already closed the book on the idea of continuity. It's as if he swept inconvenient evidence under the rug and then declared the floor spotless. Why does this matter? Because the past is never just about the past. It shapes how people see themselves today. If all traces of tradition are denied, Wicca looks like a hollow invention. Outsiders read Hutton's work and then turn around and repeat it as fact. They'll say something like, "See, witches made it all up." But if you look at the ignored evidence, the folk healers, the seasonal rites, the ecstatic journeys, you start to see a different picture. Modern witchcraft isn't an unbroken survival, but it isn't a random invention either. It's a revival that draws on countless echoes of the old ways, woven together into something new and meaningful. This pattern of dismissal also raises bigger questions about how history gets written. Historians like Hutton often claim they're being objective, but choosing which sources to highlight and which to downplay is never neutral. It shapes the story. By ignoring ecstatic traditions or goddess cults, Hutton didn't just write history, he created a new narrative, one that fit neatly into his little framework while leaving out the messy, fascinating contradictions of real life. And the truth is, those contradictions are often where the most important insights lie. I am talking about shining light on those blind spots. It's about asking what happens when we stop ignoring the evidence. We see a Europe where folk magic thrived alongside Christianity. We see communities where fairies, spirits, and goddesses were as real as the parish priest. We see that witchcraft accusations weren't always random. Sometimes they reflected real practices that didn't fit comfortably within the church's vision of the world. By recovering this ignored evidence, we get back a sense of heritage, not in the simplistic way Gardner or Murray imagined, but in a more honest and exciting way. Wicca isn't ancient in the sense of being unchanged for thousands of years, but it is ancient in the sense that it carries echoes of the old magic, reshaped and reborn for our time. That's far richer than the sterile, disconnected version Hutton left us with. And that's the heart of what I'm talking about, reminding ourselves that history isn't just what one scholar says it is. It's a conversation, and when voices are ignored, the story gets distorted. If we want a fuller picture of who we are and where we come from, we have to look at the evidence that Hutton left out. When a book changes how people see an entire religion, it doesn't just stay in the library. It seeps into everyday conversations, classrooms, news articles, and even the way practitioners see themselves. That's exactly what happened with Ronald Hutton's The Triumph of the Moon. His version of witchcraft's history didn't just stay tucked away in academic circles. It spilled out into the public and began shaping how Wicca and paganism are viewed today. The damage, unfortunately, has been real and long-lasting. Let's start with the most obvious effect: credibility. Before Hutton, many witches held on to the idea that our craft had deep historical roots stretching back to pre-Christian Europe. Even if the details were fuzzy or exaggerated, the sense of tradition gave us dignity and a place in the story of human spirituality. After Triumph, the dominant narrative became that Wicca was essentially a modern invention. Outsiders seized on this. Journalists, skeptics, and even curious neighbors would repeat, "Oh, that's not a religion, it was just made up in the 1950s. It gave society at large permission to dismiss us as play actors rather than members of a living, evolving spiritual tradition. Inside the community, the fallout was even more personal. Imagine dedicating your life to a path that you feel connects you to your ancestors and the natural world around you, only to be told that the connection is nothing but smoke and mirrors. For some, Hutton's conclusions planted seeds of doubt that grew into disillusionment. There are stories of coven leaders stepping away, practitioners abandoning their altars, and seekers turning back before they even got started, all because they were convinced they'd been sold a lie. That's not just academic theory. That's real lives being reshaped by one historian's narrative. But the damage didn't stop with individuals. Hutton's work gave the mainstream a weapon. When pagans fought for recognition, whether for religious rights, chaplain access, or equal footing in public spaces, critics often leaned on his conclusions to undermine us. This isn't an ancient faith, they'd say. It's a hobby someone cobbled together. In legal battles and cultural debates, that dismissal mattered. A faith with no history sounds less serious, less deserving of respect. Hutton may not have intended it, but his book became ammunition for those who wanted to keep paganism on the margins. Another consequence is more subtle but just as painful: the internal split it caused. Some pagans embraced Hutton's view, arguing that Wicca's power doesn't need history to validate it. Others felt betrayed and pushed back hard, insisting that our practices do carry echoes of older traditions, whether Hutton acknowledged them or not. This divide created tension, sometimes even hostility, between different corners of the pagan world. Instead of uniting us, triumph set us arguing about whether our roots mattered at all. Again, I remind everybody, this wasn't just about Wicca. This is about paganism in general too. So even if you're not Wiccan right now and you're something else, heathen, whatever you might be, this includes all of us. What makes this particularly ironic is that Wicca, like every religion, is a blend of myth, ritual, and meaning. Christianity has the nativity story. Buddhism has its own legendary origins. No one dismisses those faiths because their myths don't line up with literal history. Yet for Wicca, Hutton's insistence on cutting away every shred of myth left many feeling that their path had been gutted. He didn't just challenge falsehoods, he undermined the very sense of belonging and sacred story that religions depend on. And here's the kicker: history doesn't have to be all or nothing. A tradition can be both modern and ancient, depending on how you look at it. Wicca may have crystallized in the 20th century, but it's built on centuries of folklore, magic practice, and goddess devotion. The festivals we celebrate are tied to seasonal rhythms older than civilization itself. To erase those connections is to rob Wicca of the richness that makes it more than just a new religion. That's the real damage, flattening something vibrant into something shallow. This is about holding up a mirror to the damage and saying, this matters. Because the way history is told shapes the way people live their faith. When scholars dismiss our roots, it affects how we're treated by outsiders and how we see ourselves. Hutton may have thought he was helping Wicca stand taller by clearing away myths, but in practice, he cut the legs out from under us. The challenge now is reclaiming the complexity, the echoes, and the beauty he ignored, so that Wicca can be honored not just as a modern invention, but as part of the long human journey of seeking the sacred. After all the debates, the criticisms, and the argument about history, we arrive at the most important part: reclaiming our story. Because at the end of the day, whether Ronald Hutton or any other historian approves doesn't define the worth of Wicca or witchcraft. What matters is how we live it, how we connect to it, and how we pass it on. This part of my story is about shaking off the weight of outside judgment and standing tall in our own truth. For too long, the pagan community has been forced into a corner where we feel the need to prove ourselves. We've been told your faith isn't old enough, or it's just something people made up recently. But here's the thing: every religion was made up at some point. Christianity had to start somewhere. Islam had a beginning. Buddhism wasn't handed down fully formed from the stars. Each path began with a group of people responding to spiritual need, weaving together myth, ritual, and experience until it blossomed into something enduring. Wicca is no different. The fact that it emerged in the 20th century doesn't make it less real. It makes it part of the living flow of human spirituality. And yet, Wicca isn't only modern. That's the part Hutton and his followers often miss. Our rituals echo folk practices that stretch back centuries. Our goddess traditions resonate with figures like Isis, Sybil, and Gaia. The seasonal festivals we celebrate align with cycles that humans have honored since the dawn of agriculture. We might not be able to draw a straight, unbroken line from pre-Christian Europe to modern coven circles, but the threads are there. They weave through folklore, mythology, and the rhythms of the natural world. When we acknowledge those echoes, we reclaim succession without needing to cling to fantasies. Reclaiming our story also means embracing myth, not running from it. Myth isn't about literal history, it's about meaning. When we talk about the goddess as the eternal mother, or the god as the horned one who dies and is reborn, we're speaking the language of myth. These stories carry truths about cycles of life, death, love, and renewal that are just as valid today as they were in the past. Other religions get to keep their myths without embarrassment. We should be able to do the same. Our myths give us identity, not because they can be proven in a history book, but because they resonate in our souls. Too often, pagans get discouraged by the dismissals of outsiders. But when we reclaim our story, we stop apologizing. We don't need to bow to scholars who tell us what's valid, and we don't need to justify ourselves to critics who mock us. Wicca is real because we live it. The magic we practice works because we experience it. The gods and spirits we honor are real in the most important sense. They inspire, guide, and transform us. That's enough. Of course, reclaiming doesn't mean ignoring history. We should keep questioning, keep researching, and keep learning. But instead of letting scholars strip away our roots, we can take the evidence they overlook, the folk traditions, the ecstatic practices and goddess cults, and weave them back into the bigger picture. We can acknowledge that Wicca is modern while still honoring the ancient influences that help shape it. This balanced view gives us strength because it's both honest and inspiring. Most importantly, reclaiming our story means taking ownership of the future. Wicca isn't stuck in the past. It's alive, evolving, and growing. Every coven, every solitary practitioner, every new ritual created adds to that tapestry. The craft continues to change because it's a living tradition. And that, in many ways, is more powerful than trying to prove it never changed at all. So when we talk about reclaiming, we're not just talking about correcting the record. We're talking about pride. We're talking about honoring both the old echoes and the new creations. We're talking about standing in the circle with confidence, knowing that our story is ours to tell, not anyone else's to define. That's the real ending to this journey. Hutton may have tried to replace one myth with another, but the story of Wicca doesn't belong to him or to any historian. It belongs to us, and the more we tell it, the stronger it becomes. At the end of all of this, what we're really talking about here isn't just history, it's identity. Ronald Hutton may have written The Triumph of the Moon with the intention of tidying up the story of Wicca, but in doing so, he also stripped away mystery, tradition, and dignity. By replacing one myth with another, he left many feeling disconnected from the very traditions that give our path depth and meaning. Yet, history is never that cut and dry. Beneath the polished narratives, the academic debates, there are still echoes of goddess worship, folk magic, and ecstatic practices that point to something much bigger than a recent invention. So as we move forward, the challenge isn't to argue endlessly with scholars, but to reclaim our story with confidence. Wicca may be modern, but it carries timeless truths, ancient rhythms, and living connection to the sacred that can't be erased by footnotes. And again, like I mentioned before, since Triumph of the Moon, Hutton has had to reiterate again about his mistakes. Our myths, our rituals, and our experiences are valid because they transform lives and open hearts. That's the real triumph, not the one written in textbooks, but the one we create every time we step into circle, call on the gods, and honor the old ways in new forms. The story of witchcraft isn't finished, and the beauty of it is this: we get to write the next chapter. Well, that's going to wrap up this episode of Witch in the Working. How do you feel about Hutton's Triumph of the Moon? Do you feel he was a positive or negative towards modern craft? Let us all know down in the comments below. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up and please subscribe if you haven't already. And don't forget to ring that little bell to be reminded of the wonderful and exciting future episodes to come. I love you guys and gals. Blessed be.